Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is an introduction to community resilience hubs. This webinar is being presented by Clean Energy Group as part of our Resilient Power project. And we have a number of exciting panelists on the line with us today. Before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few quick webinar logistics. All of our attendees are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of our webinar. You can either call in via telephone or you can connect via computer mic and speakers. If you'd like to minimize the webinar console so that you can view our presentation full screen, you can do that by clicking on the orange arrow that you see circled on your webinar console. And you can also click on the arrow to expand your webinar console. And one of the things that you might like to do on your webinar console is to submit your questions and your comments. We're going to save about 15 minutes for a Q&A with our panelists following their presentations. And we're going to get to as many questions as we can. So please do submit your questions and your comments as you think of them. Finally, this webinar is being recorded. We'll send you an email with a copy of the webinar recording and a PDF of the slides. I'll probably get that out to you this afternoon. And we'll also post all of those materials on our website at cleanegroup.org/webinars. So all of that will be posted there, and that's also a good link to know because it's where we post upcoming webinars in addition to our archived webinars. So with that, I'm now gonna pass it over to our moderator for today's webinar, Abby Ramanan. Abby is a project manager here at Clean Energy Group, and she is going to get us started. Over to you, Abby.
Great, thank you, Sam, and thank you all so much for joining us today. It should be a very exciting webinar. To give you all a bit of background on Clean Energy Group, we are a national nonprofit based in Montpelier, Vermont. We are funded primarily by private foundations, several of which you can see listed here. We also have a sister organization, Clean Energy States Alliance, and that is a membership organization of state agencies that manage clean energy funds around the country. One of CEG's biggest projects is the Resilient Power project, and Seth is going to talk a bit more about that, so I'll only give you all a brief overview. The Resilient Power project was developed about 8 years ago in the wake of Superstorm Sandy with the goal of enabling access to resilient power technologies for under-resourced communities, and which resilient power technologies for us primarily means solar and battery storage. This work is a reflection of the fact that most underserved communities, particularly communities of color, are the ones hit the hardest by widespread power outages in the wake of serious climate disasters. Through this work, we put out a variety of resources, including reports, some of which you can see pictured here, as well as webinars like this one, and all of those can be accessed on our website at cleanegroup.org. In addition to this, we also work with policymakers to enable more equitable access to resilient power technologies, and we also support actual solar and storage project development. And this slide shows some of those projects that we've supported through both in-house analysis as well as providing small technical assistance grants to cover the cost of pre-development feasibility analyses. And some of the highlighted projects you see here are ones that received those pre-development grants and were able to successfully carry that through to implementation of solar and storage. We often, through this work, we often collaborate with the Urban Sustainability Directors Network to identify and support these projects, which is a good segue to introduce our speakers for today. So our first speaker is Kristin Baja, who goes by Baja. She is USDN's Program Director for Climate Resilience. She is responsible for helping local governments identify strategic ways to advance equity-centered climate resilience and build their capacity to take proactive action. At USDN, Baja focuses her time on supporting members and partners in working at the nexus of racial equity, resilience, and mitigation, while also helping to facilitate deeper relationships between local governments and community-based partners. Baja pioneered the Resilience Hub concept and has been supporting Resilience Hub development for over 8 years. She holds a Master's of Urban Planning and a Master's of Science from the University of Michigan, and in 2016, she was recognized by the Obama administration as a champion of change for her work on climate and equity. Our second speaker is Seth Mullendore. Seth is Vice President and Project Director for Clean Energy Group, where he oversees projects ranging from consumer-sited solar and battery storage to the replacement of power plants with clean technologies. Seth works with policymakers, project developers, industry advocates, and community environmental justice groups to advance clean energy policies and projects with the focus on achieving greater access to solar and battery storage technologies for disadvantaged communities. Much of his work pertains to the research and reporting of energy storage technologies, policies, and supporting market structures. And prior to joining Clean Energy Group, Seth served as a Sustainable Energy Fellow with the Union of Concerned Scientists and worked with Maine Clean Communities to advance clean transportation initiatives. He holds a MS in Civil and Environmental Engineering from Stanford University and a BS in Geosciences from the University of Southern Maine. I will now turn it over to our wonderful speakers.
All right. Thank you so much. And I'm excited to be here today with you. So my name is Baja, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge three things. First, that I'm on the land of the Anishinaabe Nation and tribes that were united in this region before colonizers arrived, and just want to acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory and honor and respect the many diverse indigenous peoples still connected to this land on which I stand and present to you today. Second, I'm going to acknowledge that I'm a white woman in a white body, even though you can't see me right now. I'm very privileged based on my skin color and my education, my position. So a lot of that privilege is societally granted and unearned just based on my skin color, and I want to acknowledge that. And third, just thank you all. I know that this is a really trying time and lots is going on. So I just want to say thank you for spending time with us today. So I would like to also just introduce you to who USDN is, just in case you don't know. So USDN is the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, and that is a practitioner network of these incredible souls, plus about 100 other primary leads from different cities around the US and Canada, as well as over 1,000 other participant members. And the network is really focused on relationships and collective action, innovation, and shifting to proactive action. So a lot of times I'll say I'm like the mycelium, essentially the underground network of fungi that supports all of our amazing trees, which are all of our member communities. So I'm very lucky and fortunate to work with a lot of these incredible members, and this is just an image of a few of them and how those relationships are built within the network. And so just to get started on resilience hubs and sort of how they were, where they're based is we have this traditional approach, the sort of archaic, top-down, racist and very disrespectful approach to government and lots of other things within this country. And we work a lot in silos. So there's a lot of lack of respect for both the interconnectivity of systems, but also cultural significance and different needs for different people. And part of the work that we focus on in USDN is how to better understand how power has shown up traditionally, and to shift our mind frame away from repeating what we were told is the right way or making climate change into a math problem, and instead focusing on relationships, community, and a lot of the other components that help us to shift power over time. And so part of that is actually being respectful and recognizing the history and the history of this country, and that government was created to protect citizens, but at the time that it was developed, citizens were considered white male landowners. And that means that this entire government was designed for one user group. So the systems and structures that we function within today were designed to protect that user group, and land was stolen from indigenous people. They were slaughtered. Black people were brought to this country as slaves and treated as free labor and property. Women were second-class citizens and also treated as properly. And one of the things I want to mention regarding this slide and the image is I'd like to actually mention Kimberly Jones in her video, How You Can Win. And in this video, she discusses the history of racism in this country as a monopoly game for 400 rounds where there's no money, no ownership, and no options. And whenever there's a turn for Black people, that the game has actually been fixed and that ownership has been taken away. And there is no way to catch up. So when we talk about equity now, it's not then approaching everything exactly the same. And if it helps to compare it to a game, think of going 400 rounds without a turn before being able to actually start playing. So the intention with resilience hubs is to get us out of this approach and the way that we've sort of done a cookie cutter from the top down and stop treating everyone the same. You know, emergency response and recovery is a really damaging cycle that benefits a few and perpetually harms our Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And the idea of using one case study as something that we should replicate across the country, even across the world, is getting in the way of realizing that a lot of these cases are based on a really specific set of circumstances, political, financial, or geographical, and that we need to shift away from that cookie cutter approach and into this uniqueness of communities, uniqueness of the people that make up that community, and realizing that it's not a one size fits all. So that's what when we're talking about resilience, and when I say things around resilience hubs, it's reframing resilience. It's not thinking of resilience in the very horrific definition that NOAA uses around bouncing back, because we aren't where we want to be. So instead of thinking of resilience as a placeholder for emergency management or just a concept of getting us back to normal after disruption, instead, how about we get away from centering the hazard and center the humans and think about the ability of the community to anticipate and accommodate and positively adapt or thrive amidst our changing conditions while also enhancing quality of life. And so this is a really big component of really focusing on social infrastructure, being more comprehensive and more community centered. And that's what resilience hubs are intended to do, is to reshift and look at that power. So just a bit of background on how and where hubs got started. I used to be the climate resilience planner for the city of Baltimore. And in starting in that position, I originally was told, oh, you know, we should make plans and build kits and give community members, you know, emergency resources and tell them where their emergency shelters are. And in going through a year and a half of that campaign and talking with people, I realized there was so much distrust of government and so much distrust for good reasons based on our racist policies and practices that most people who would use those shelters would never go to them. And not only that, but they wouldn't come to a lot of other events held by government or other stakeholder partners because of that distrust. And so we led into having, we kind of halted that program and went into having conversations and community dialogue and actually activating an ambassador network to learn more about what people's needs were and how they would want to be supported. And that came into the shift of perspective around more self-determination, not relying on government, not needing to wait until, you know, for example, we had a big event called Snowmageddon, and our Black neighborhoods were the last neighborhoods to be cleared out from under over 7 feet of snow. And so just acknowledging that racism is still alive and well in government. Government still prioritizes dense economic centers over neighborhoods. How do we make that shift to enable communities to react, respond, recover, and thrive on their own without reliance on government? So that shifted into an approach of neighborhoods and focusing on neighborhoods and getting into resilience hubs. And this is just a general definition of resilience hubs that helps to bring us together around that sort of holistic vision. But what I'll note is that a resilience hub is a community node. In a lot of ways, they're like a community center with all the resources, funding, and additional infrastructure to be able to support the community regardless of an event. They do require government and other stakeholders to willingly shift power over to members of the community. And so that's a really important point. They're not just about doing a roof retrofit or putting in an air conditioning unit. It's actually about that power shifting and that self-determination through a site. So one thing that we do make sure is to note that resilience hubs do consist of a building or a set of buildings. It typically have some sort of outdoor space. They will have certain components that allow them to be there for the community in the event of any type of disruption. And so that's backup power, access to resources, food, water, charging stations. In some cases, they can act temporarily as a sheltering location, but most often they're not. They're not intended to be a shelter. They're really intended to support community cohesiveness and connectivity before, during, and after a disruption and year-round, to strengthen communities by providing those resources and programs and services that are needed. So I think the big thing is I will note is that the key for this is that resilience hubs are not emergency shelters or emergency sites. They're intended to be functioning year-round. And even though all neighborhoods are unique and different, and we want these hubs to be unique and different, we've come up over the last 8 years or so with a set of foundational areas or 5 key foundational components that make up a resilience hub. And that's resilient services and programming, communications, building and landscape, power systems and operations. And Seth is going to go more into the power systems, and so I'm not going to jump into that. But I will go into some of these other areas. Another key piece to note is when I'm talking about resilience, we're not talking, again, around just the disruption. We're not centering the hazard. So what we've done with USDN and a lot of our members is to see resilience in different modes, where we have this sort of everyday non-disruption mode, where there's nothing big that's actually happening, no major disruption are present, but we still have that primary need to focus on giving people services and programs that they need and to facilitate that relationship building. This is a lot of where the preparedness and proactive work will come into play. In the disruption mode, and we have different types of disruptions, but this is where, you know, we have those natural disasters or health-related disasters and human influence disruptions, and those can vary in timelines. You know, we have a lot of focus on big hurricanes or flood events, but you know, we just have we're in still a global pandemic, and that's a very long-term disruption. And what does that mean when we're thinking about resilience? And then there's that recovery mode, which I think a lot of us are heading into now, which is that process of returning to everyday mode with new lessons and new opportunities to restore into better operating conditions. So I sort of talked through those, but I'll also just mention for the slides that the everyday mode is that holistic year-round human-centered component, where we want to increase adaptive capacity and focus on our everyday stressors. So if you think of anything with this, it's just that community cornerstone where people can go to gather to get trusted information. And then we have disruption mode and recovery mode that I already went into. But in all of these modes, we're looking to shift power to community members and to reframe what resilience means in communities. The other piece about resilience hubs is we haven't found the amazing pot of money that's going to fund proactive action and fund Black, Indigenous, people of color, and low-income communities first and foremost. It just has not happened. And so they do require a phasing in over time. And this is how we go through decision-making with community members and to have them be the ones determining what happens at a site by building in baseline, optional, and ideal. So the baseline being, what are the elements that we need for this site or this physical location to transition from its current use into a full resilience hub use? What are the certain components in one of these foundational areas that might be missing, or several components in these 5 foundational areas that are missing that we need to be focusing on? The optional is then sort of, what do we want to do in the next 1 to 2 years, where we may have additional funding coming in, we may build up capacity. What are some of these other things that we need to better meet community needs in all of the different modes? And then ideal, if we have a lot of money come through and a lot of capacity and a lot of support, what do we want to see this site be? And that's a lot of times where we'll have communities put in things like living building challenge or, you know, community solar or something like that. So just to note that, to acknowledge that these are really phased in over time. So in order to do that, this is an example or an image of how we go through a community process or a workshop where we start with the 5 main resilience areas. We build in those 3 modes of everyday disruption and recovery, and then we start to identify with community members what's the baseline, optional, and ideal. We do this often on a whiteboard or on a big, huge wall where everybody will come up and sort of identify for themselves. Or we even do walkthroughs where we have folks have these on clipboards and they're writing as they go along, and then we put the information together at the end. But it's a really great opportunity to bring folks together to identify what's most important for that site and for that specific community. In the services and programming space, the questions that we ask are what do community members want and need from this site? What is missing in the neighborhood right now in all 3 modes? And how do we create a space that meets the needs for these basic services while also creating a space for innovation and beneficial programming? I listed some examples here. A lot of this is around thinking of all the different types of users, including our aging population or our population with different ability levels, young people, mental health support, and just thinking about opportunities to enhance and improve the services and programs at the site. The next one is that communications piece and really getting into the proactive communications. I mentioned the relationship building and the key connectivity. How are we proactively connecting people? How are we building trust with each other? How are we ensuring that people actually feel like they're part of the community? Those are really hard things, not only to measure, but then to also to continuously support. And so offering spaces for relationship building and also access to other communication platforms. Instead of just doing the typical FEMA community emergency response team training, which is all based on response and recovery, we're focusing on creating a CERT level 11 that actually has community members as ambassadors going out and adopting a block and getting to know everybody on that block. So in the event of a disruption, they actually know folks, they understand if they're on certain medications or on respirators or have kids who maybe have a single parent who is not home, so that they're able to check in on them in the event of any type of disruption, but also just for everyday needs. And then it's also just, you know, focusing on a lot of educational programs. So communications being a big piece. The building and landscape is another pretty big one, and this connects deeply, I think, to what Seth will talk to. You know, we need to make sure that the building can support a lot of what demands will be had from it. So air filtration and air quality have been a really big one, especially with wildfire seasons, and as we see those continue and our air quality in urban areas being particularly low. How are we making sure to have air filtration and high air quality, thinking about significant heating and cooling, roof retrofits and new windows, but then also thinking about this sort of connectivity with the surrounding landscape. And if there are open spaces, how can that be used for shade structures or planting of trees, thinking about food generation, healing spaces, et cetera. So making sure that landscape and building are really connected and connected for all user groups. I'm not going to go into this foundational area because Seth's going to talk about it in depth, but I will say that it's a key element for USDN members and for our network to make sure that we're focusing on getting away from the idea of generators and generators where there's been lots of human error, especially as we've seen with other sort of hurricanes, and this was documented pretty well in Hurricane Sandy, where there were a lot of maintenance issues or lack of understanding how to use generators. And so we're focusing a lot more on energy efficiency, greenhouse gas mitigation as part of this work and building that in. And we have some really amazing partners in this space, CEG being one of those. And then the fifth foundational area is one that often is overlooked, but is incredibly important. And this is, how will the site actually operate? What are the hours of operations? Do those change in the different modes? Does it have the ability to serve all members of the community? And is it intended for certain user groups in one area versus another? I get asked a lot of questions about our houseless population, and are there separate entrances, showers, lockers, other opportunities for the site to be utilized in different manners so that every user group has the ability to utilize the site. So making sure that we're considering the navigation of interactions and intersections is important. This is where we talk a lot about safety, security, hours of operation, and what the site does and does not have. So beyond the sort of resilience hub, there are a lot of communities that are also thinking about resilience from their full neighborhood. Some neighborhoods are very large and unable to utilize just one hub. Right now, there's actually, the city of Houston is focusing on what they're calling their resilience hub lily pad approach, which is to have resilience hubs in lots of different areas and lots of different parts of the neighborhood. And certain hubs may specialize in specific elements. So in one area, there may be more around youth programming and programming for mental health and trauma. In another area, it might be more for aging population and recreation and different types of services. So just also noting that it's still focused on connectivity and cohesiveness in this sort of integrating of all the different components talked about before, but in more of a larger scale. So there's also a piece of making the case around resilience hubs and why to focus on these over emergency shelters or short-term sites that open in the event of a disruption. And so I'm not going to read the slide to you. It's my text-heavy slide, but I will just mention there is a real return on investment of putting money and time and capacity into communities and shifting power to communities holistically, thinking about that cohesion, thinking about the coordination, thinking about all those benefits. There really is a benefit. And so we are trying to capture that fiscally now and to show some of the numbers so that it's easier to make the case. But this is something that's just really critical to bring into any discussion around a resilience hub, that it is a good upfront investment. And then here's the, I got made fun of a little for having an octopus on the cover of this presentation, but it's intended to show that hubs come in many different shapes and sizes, that they're very adaptable and flexible and have lots of unique elements that reflect the unique community in which they serve. So I mentioned the 5 foundational areas, but there's a lot of flexibility and decision-making that happens within those foundational areas. The big thing is to recognize that resilience hubs are not emergency shelters. They're not only for this, disruption. There's this real commitment to changing the paradigm and shifting the power to communities and essentially being more fluid and flexible, like an octopus, where we get out of our traditional structures and move into something quite different than what we've seen as the norm. I also mentioned that we did have a few hubs that were progressing during COVID and how they were used. This is an article that was quickly published in the beginning of the pandemic, but essentially just identifying how hubs could be used in the event of COVID and other pandemics. And that's really for making community-based testing and vaccination easy to access. Certainly neighborhood distribution, a lot of the hubs stepped in and became food, water, and resource distribution centers, which were really critical in lots of communities. Certainly locations for coordinating childcare and programming, and then there was a lot of organization of virtual platforms and thinking about how kids could get support going through school and all the needs that happened during COVID. So just wanted to mention that we did have some experience with that in certain areas, and they really stepped up. There is a website with a lot of resources. We're actually going to be updating with more resources within the next month. The website's here on the bottom. This is where we have started putting all of our Resilience Hub work, the guidebooks for how to create a Resilience Hub, and a lot of the information I just put here. The thing to note is there's a really simple and easy introduction to Resilience Hub. There's been a project that we did with American Microgrid Solutions to create a solar and storage framework and sort of that techno-economic feasibility assessment, looking at the resilience power systems. There's the step-by-step guidance for hub development, and then we also have a spreadsheet to support folks in going through an assessment on site, both of their security and things like their kitchen assessment, how to set up their internal team. This is not a tool; it's legit an Excel spreadsheet so that people can change it and access it. And then I just will note that we have a lot of hubs that are in progress and a lot of amazing partners that are working with us on these hubs as well. American Microgrid Solutions and Clean Energy Group are some of our great partners that are working on the resilient power solutions. We have Climate Resolve and NorCal Resilience Network that are working in California. South Base is working with us in Georgia. And then we have some really excellent partners kind of around the country. A lot of these are USDN member communities that are shifting power to their community-based partners to move forward on hubs. And we're seeing a lot of really great activation in community around that. One of the other things that I thought I would proactively get to, because I know that this is a question I get almost all the time, is how are these funded and how do we do this? One thing I will note is that, like I said, there is no single source of funding, although we really are trying to push on some of the federal government programs, specifically on FEMA, to allocate funding, and especially from BRIC and other funding resources, into this proactive work. So we are really trying to look at bringing in different sources of funding for all the different foundational areas. Right now, the majority of funds have come from foundations, either local or regional, some national foundations to support the work. But there is no specific source of funds right now, so it's a bit of a puzzle. The other thing I'll note is a lot of the work that we're doing is a collective commons. So we're working together to adjust and improve the model and to build off of where some things have been successful or other things have failed. Really good outreach opportunities that are potentially gonna, be beneficial in more than one community. But again, we're not creating case studies. We're doing things called progress reports to show where folks are, because it's not ending. And these projects will not be done at any point, just like resilience is not done at any point. But there are a lot of cascading benefits of investing in resilience hubs. They are not going to be the silver bullet for climate change, not at all. But they are a way to get us out of this idea of response recovery, or just invest in some infrastructure and everything will be fine. This is really a shift to a more holistic vision of resilience that will have cascading benefits, both socially, environmentally, and I think technologically over time. So that is my contact information. And Seth, I'm going to turn it over to you for some of the amazing projects that we've been working on together.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Baja. It's been a real pleasure working with Baja over the past several years. The Clean Energy Group has had the honor of being a part of the Resilience Hub work. So I'm going to be focusing on energy resilience. So one piece of the Resilience Hub component that Clean Energy Group specializes in. We have created the Resilient Power Project, which Abby introduced in the beginning. As she said, it was about 8 years ago after Superstorm Sandy in the Northeast. This was in recognition of the fact that the individuals and communities hit worst by outages, particularly those around natural disasters, tend to be the individuals and communities with the least access to resources to be able to explore solutions to those problems and to be able to fund solutions to those problems. So the Resilient Power Project was designed to fill a gap, to be able to provide resources and be able to help build that local capacity around energy resilience, specifically solar and energy storage. So we've worked with over 250 facilities across the US in 25 states and territories. And a big component of our work are small grants to offset some of the pre-development costs. So the analysis of, is solar and storage feasible for my site? What does it look like? What does it cost? We've rewarded around 50, well, more than 50 grants, almost over 80 grants now to about 50 organizations, approaching $1 million in grant awards that we put out there to help advance these projects, and many of which have been in partnership with USDN. I wanted to just get in a little bit about energy storage because that's kind of the new technology here in the mix, newer than solar. As this starts, so this is from Energy Sage and North American Board of Certified Energy Practitioners, looking at the attachment rates for energy storage and interest with solar. You can see that year over year, interest and installations have grown. And you can list certain states. The most striking of these is Puerto Rico. And this is from 2020, showing that we've got almost all systems going in have an energy storage component. There's a huge shift. Very few systems include energy storage for a solar installation prior to Hurricane Maria. And this leads to another finding from the report from Energy Sage and NABCEP that the primary driver for energy storage is resilience. That is what drives most of the installations, and that has grown substantially. To see in 2020, 65% of projects listed resilience as the driving factor. But as you saw on the previous slide, interest doesn't always translate into installations. So the biggest barrier that they identified in the reporting was that batteries are too expensive, which was the main driver, and also followed by the fact that there was not enough incentives for battery storage. Clean Energy Group, we did our own reporting, looking specifically at solar and storage in low-income communities, community serving facilities. Specifically, a lot of the respondents were affordable housing providers and community services providers, so local community-based organizations. And in our reporting, we did see that economic feasibility was a big barrier for projects. You can see over 50% of projects reported that as a barrier. But the primary biggest barriers, over 65% of folks said that lack of information about battery storage was one of the biggest barriers for them in a project, followed by technical issues and then permitting and interconnection issues. And these are all related around technical assistance. So that was the reason we created our technical assistance program, to address that need and to be able to provide resources so that folks in the early stages of project could do that assessment. This slide just goes into some of the factors to consider with a solar and storage project. There's a lot to think about. Solar sizing, battery sizing, placement, interconnection with the utility, how the system should be configured. And then for the resilience component of the system, just putting in solar and storage does not mean that you will automatically have backup power. You need to figure out how you're going to be configuring your system. Sometimes the systems are configured to back up a whole facility, but that's often cost prohibitive, prohibitively expensive, particularly for the energy storage that's required to back up a full building. So then you've got to think about either incorporating some sort of traditional backup power, such as a generator, or isolating loads so that you have a subset of loads that you need to keep operations up and running, whatever those are. So those are those dotted line circles that you see. There's a critical load panel that powers certain specified loads in a power outage. Anything within that dotted box there will continue to be powered by solar and battery storage. Anything that's on the main electrical panel that's not in the critical loads will not be powered in an emergency situation. So there's a lot to consider when these systems are installed. And when you're dealing with existing infrastructure, there's a lot of complexities that just go along with what does the existing electrical system look like or the conditions of the building. So I'm going to talk about one specific project that we worked on that they are becoming a resilience hub. This is the California Indian Museum and Cultural Center in Santa Rosa, California, CIMCC. And the feasibility analysis was done in partnership with American Microgrid Solutions, who Baja also mentioned. They are a partner on the Resiliency Hub effort and a partner of ours at Clean Energy Group in our Resilient Power project as well. They have become our go-to services provider for analyses, although we are open to working with other organizations. So CIMCC is was created to educate the public about the history, cultural, and contemporary life of California Indians and to honor their contributions to civilization. The communities served by CIMCC have been impacted by multiple wildfire events in recent years and utility power shutoffs from wildfire prevention measures. So reliability and access to energy has become a real burden for the communities. The goal of the Resilience Hub effort for CIMCC is to provide services during what are called public power safety shutoff events. Those are when wildfires are threatened and the utility proactively shuts off power to communities. Unfortunately, they don't provide communities with many resources to respond to those outages, and it's created a real health crisis and energy crisis in California. The Resilience Hub will be designed to counteract the impacts of wildfires. So it will have clean air filtration for the poor air quality from debris from wildfires. It will also act as a cooling center to be able to protect the surrounding populations during extreme heat. We were fortunate to have the executive director of CIMCC, Nikki Lim, present at a webinar on May 6th. So if you want to learn more about their effort, you can go there. I'm going to talk specifically about the feasibility analysis done by American Microgrid. This was done back in July, so the project has kind of evolved since then, but I want to use this as an example. I'm really going to go through these pretty quick. This is just to give folks an idea of what goes into analysis, what needs to be considered. One of the biggest factors is, what do utility rates look like? That has to do with what is going to be the economic feasibility of installing the system. What are the benefits of solar as far as reducing costs? Can energy storage help reduce costs by looking at reducing demand charges or other related charges for time varying rates? So for this project, they actually were switching to a new utility rate while we were doing the analysis. So that had to be considered as part of the analysis. Another important, very important component to the analysis is, what is the load profile for the building look like? So the load profile is how do they use energy over time? And you can see, depending on the year, there are increasing or decreasing demands. So if you have an outage that were to occur in winter months, you would need to support a lot less than, say, in August or September, when you have a lot of cooling loads that are necessary. So the load for the site is extremely important, and not all sites have access to that information from their utility. Then you need to look at the components that you're going to be analyzing for the building. So most of that is solar and energy storage. This looks at some of the considerations for solar. There's a schematic at the bottom there showing the design of a rooftop system for CIMCC, so they could put on about 74 kilowatts of solar, and they were looking to offset a lot of their usage at the site. Energy storage has similar considerations. You have to think about, where can you put energy storage and how big does the system need to be? For solar, of course, rooftop conditions are a big consideration, shading, angles of the roof, a lot of different things to factor into an analysis. Then there's the resilience side of things. One of the biggest components to that is what are you going to be backing up? In this case, they were looking at 100% of the site load. They need to be completely operational during an outage. Not every site is like that. A lot of sites designate a specific area or specific services that they need to have up and running. And then there's the duration. How long do you anticipate you're going to need power for? In this case, they were looking at 3 days, so 72 hours. And it's difficult to design a system that provides 100% guaranteed resilience. Sometimes you're going to have less solar. Sometimes you're going to have higher loads. The battery may be partially discharged for some reason or another. So they look at what's called a target confidence level. So how secure in the fact that you're going to be able to make that 72 hours do you need to be? And for this project, they were looking at 75% confidence level. At 75% of the time, you'll be able to get to 72 hours with the system design. And based on all of this, which usually has multiple iterations and changing variables along time, you get the results. So you get the solar system sizing, the battery system sizing, and estimates of cost and payback. They include financial metrics such as the internal rate of return, what's the return on this project, and the net present value. So how valuable is it versus the cost over time. And based on that, you can make some decisions about what to do next. This could be opening up a request for proposals to start engaging with developers, or it could be to submit to grant opportunities, knowing the cost that you're going to need to cover and the sizing that you'll need for a project. So the folks that we worked with in these use these results in a variety of different ways, and we try to help them work through that process as well. So this site is still in the pre-development stage, but it is moving forward, which is very exciting based on waiting to figure out some incentives for the storage side. I just wanted to give a quick look at a project that has been installed and is up and running in Washington, D.C. This is Maycroft Apartments. It's about 100 units of affordable housing in Washington, D.C. This is Jubilee Housing, and we worked with New Partners Community Solar on this project. In the basement, there is a battery system that provides power for refrigeration, fans, microwaves, lighting, TV, and outlets. The rooftop solar system is a community solar system, and residents are getting about $40 off of their monthly electricity bills for every household at Maycroft Apartments through the community solar. So it's not an official resilience hub, but this is a lot of the idea of the kinds of things that resilience hubs can provide for a community in an outage situation. So I'm going to end there and open up to questions. I know we've got a lot of folks on the line. So, Abby?
Great. Well, as you said, Seth, we got a lot of questions, so I'm going to try and get through these as quickly as I can, but we may not get through all of them. So first, to kind of just open up, Baja, like, how did USDN kind of come up with a sort of people-centered definition of resilience? What did that process look like?
Well, USDN really focuses on ensuring that all of our members have training and an understanding of the history of both the United States and Canada, the true history of theft of land and slaughter of people, as well as just how we work for government that still perpetuates inequities. And so in doing any of our work, whether it's resilience mitigation or general sustainability, we as a network have decided that everything is grounded in equity and racial equity. And so the definition of resilience is something that I think a lot of people debate, but essentially in working with our community-based partners and our community members, just noting that it can't be something that focuses on a disruption, because we miss so many of the key components of resilience and what's needed for communities in this comprehensive year-round way. So it's evolved. It's really been something that's been co-developed with community partners and with our neighborhoods and members of those neighborhoods. And it's also been something where we continuously are pushing back on the more archaic definition to just say this isn't getting to people's needs. So that was the process.
Great. And this kind of builds off of that. And this is a question for both of you, but what are some kind of key elements that state or municipal governments should consider including if they want to start opening up funding to ensure that funding is supporting kind of a holistic approach to resilience that isn't just going to create another emergency shelter in a already well-resourced neighborhood?
I can start if you want, Seth, but I think one of the key things is we have to figure out a way to pay people and to see members of the community as partners in implementation. I really hope we get out of this idea of one and done engagement, or we went out and had a meeting and got input and now we're going to move forward with this plan. That's not a respectful approach to anything. And so I think with any sort of project, process, program, as we're seeking funding, as we're developing these ideas and concepts, it's bringing community-based partners and community members into that phase of the process and respecting their ideas, respecting their lived experience, but also making sure that they're compensated exactly the same way that you are to be part of that process. You know, I'm not saying everybody goes on salary, but I am saying to value people's time and to go to them to make it easier for them to be part of any process. I often think that government and then a lot of our partners shouldn't be the ones having the conversations. A lot of times there's exclusionary language used or just more harm done. And so there's also this piece of part of the power shifting is to ensure that resources, capacity, information is coming through a community partner, through trusted community members, and building that into our projects, I think is going to be really important from in all phases.
Yeah, and I'll just you know, add from the energy perspective, from what we've seen with programs. You know, far too often I've heard folks saying that, well, there's just not a need for this because we put together a program around microgrids or energy resilience, and we didn't get much uptake. There was not much interest in it. And the question is, well, how did you get word out about the program? And usually there's not much of a response there, and certainly not, as Baja is recommending, working within trusted institutions that are already in the communities. And that's the best way to get the word out and reach the communities you're trying to reach. The other thing is, it gets back to that resources and capacity constraints, where sometimes the application process for funds requires a lot of information already being there. So I've seen that you need to have the size of the system and know what a budget is prior to going out for funds. And that requires time and funding to be able to get those resources in place. So you need to have a mechanism for everyone to be able to access that, not just well-resourced communities, which are not generally who you're trying to reach through these programs. So that's a common barrier that we've seen again and again.
Great, yeah, all really good points. We've gotten a few questions about sort of the more operational element of these resilience hubs. So what are kinds of core community partnerships you've seen that have worked really well as foundation for a resilience hub? And how are these kind of normally owned and operated? Is it often kind of municipal or state governments who are operating the resilience hubs, or are they more often nonprofits? And how does that kind of handoff work?
Yeah, it's unique, right? In each different location, there's a different setup, which is again why we say there isn't like the one resilience hub everybody should be looking at as a model. I will say that I believe the most successful hubs are ones that are not in government owned and managed buildings, because it doesn't allow the flexibility and sort of the adaptability of the types of programs, services, and other sort of just components that are necessary in order to best serve the community. Government doesn't shift very fast. There's lots of things to go through with legal and with other sort of hoops. So we always recommend with our members and other stakeholders that if these are in community centers or with nonprofits or community-based partners, that's when they will best serve the community. And I think one of the other things to note, just to connect to the other project or question from before, is if they're going to be supported by government and other traditional models, that thinking about shifting resources, power, and capacity means bringing in legal ahead of time and elements related to insurance to make sure that there are not ownership issues. A lot of times if legal is not brought in the very beginning, then government feels like they still need to own and manage everything, and that's a real problem in the long run. We do have some great successful models that are progressing forward. Right now, I would say Boyle Heights in Los Angeles is an incredible site that's moving forward. Cambridge Community Center is another incredible example up in the Northeast that's moving forward. Both actually started as community centers focused on meeting community needs first and foremost for their specific communities, and then built in the other foundational areas and continue to over time.
Great, yeah. We also have a lot of questions about specifically kind of the solar and storage element within resilience hubs. So one, is there a role for standalone battery storage within a resilience hub, or energy efficiency upgrades, and how do those play into kind of the sorts of analyses that folks like American Microgrid Services are doing?
Yeah, those are both great questions. So efficiency is always something that should be considered. Our focus is on the backup power solutions, but energy efficiency, the more efficient the loads that you're going to be supporting, the longer you can support those loads, and the less you're going to have to spend to be able to put in a system that supports those. So we have a lot of projects that are looking at upgrading HVAC systems, for instance, that changes the load a lot and can make things much more efficient. Although sometimes can be more energy intensive if you're going from shifting from gas to, say, heat pumps. So efficiency should always be considered as a first pass and is an important component. As far as standalone batteries go, there certainly is a role there. Batteries can provide energy resilience on their own. The issue with batteries is that there is no source of recharging them. So you can have them power loads for a certain amount of time, but unless you have a source of on-site generation, then once they're done, they're done. If you have solar on site or even a generator, then you can recharge batteries. So that's the more ideal solution, but particularly for smaller applications and homes, residents, a battery itself can provide a great deal of backup power. That's usually enough for shorter to mid-duration outages.
Great, thanks, Seth. We also had a question on how the value of resilience could play a factor in financial analysis. And I wonder if either of you could speak more to how you can evaluate resilience and put an actual monetary figure on it.
Baja, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. I could say that that's a glaring problem that we see across the board. There have been some methodologies that have looked at valuing resilience. There's a group called Clean Coalition in California that has a methodology that shows a lot of promise. There's some national labs that have worked on just looking at very general metrics, but those are not good at capturing the value of community resilience projects. So from what I've seen, that's a problem that still has not been fully addressed.
Yeah, I think a lot of the models too are based on traditional definition of resilience, and in a lot of ways still focused on the hazard and what folks are doing in the midst of a hazard. If we're looking at metrics related to improving access to healthcare, improving connectivity, asking people whether they feel like they're part of the community or if somebody in their community will check in on them, asking if they know where they would go to get information that they trust. It's a way for those who are taking metrics to be able to build in qualitative and quantitative metrics and to value them differently. And that is, I think, a real challenge that still exists because of the traditional model, because we still try to make climate change and social equity into a math problem, which they're not. They're much more elaborate. And so I would say we need to build in elements that are cascading benefits over time, and certainly not attach those to political timeframes, because most of those benefits are not going to happen within 2 to 4 years.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you both. Those are both very thoughtful answers to a very complicated question that I think all of us are still struggling with. I know we're getting close to the top of the hour, so I just want to ask one final question. The Biden administration has included elements of social infrastructure in the infrastructure package that's pushing forward. I'd be curious, Baja, if you had any thoughts on how you see resilience hubs fitting into that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think the Biden administration has made part of the infrastructure package the idea of caring for the economy by creating jobs and thinking about benefits for home care, thinking about looking at social infrastructure, health and safety as core components of infrastructure, which we haven't seen before. And so resilience hubs not only touch on our need to a saying that I dislike entirely, but this idea of building back and doing so better with our infrastructure, but also bringing in those social elements and that social cohesion and connectivity, thinking about, benefiting those with the most need first and foremost. And so I do think that there's this piece with Resilience Hub of taking a targeted universalism approach, which is essentially acknowledging the needs of all people in a community matter, but we need to be focusing on the needs of those who've been intentionally marginalized and disenfranchised first and foremost. And hubs should be sited in those neighborhoods and in those communities, and the resources allocated through those sites in order to benefit those in the most need. So I think hubs provide a mechanism to test how we can do what the administration is attempting to do with its infrastructure bill a little better.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Baja and Seth, for joining us today. And thank you all for attending this webinar. I'll hand it over to Sam to close us up.
Thanks, Abby. So I'm putting up on your screen now contact info for Seth and Abby and information about the Resilient Power website, Clean Energy Group's website. Those are up on your screen. We'll be emailing you this afternoon with a copy of the webinar slides and the recording. We don't currently have any webinars scheduled coming up. Usually at this point, I'd let you know about upcoming webinars. We're working on some, and we'll have details soon for you. But in the meantime, please do visit our website and keep an eye out for the webinar materials. Those will be coming your way soon. So thanks again, everybody. Thank you, Baja, Seth, and Abby. Great webinar. Really appreciate everyone being here, and we will see you at the next one. Bye, everyone.